At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on May 7, 1972, two young students from Francesca College, Mary Bessie and Anita Lucis, were standing on the roadside waiting for a taxi or bus to take them to Stanford University. Suddenly, a strange man appeared and stopped his car next to them, claiming he had enough time to drive them to their destination. Without questioning his intentions, they both got into his car, unaware that they were walking into a deadly trap, getting into a vehicle with one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. The man soon veered off the road to a secluded area, which raised alarms and suspicions in the girls. They began to ask him about their destination, at which point he pulled out a gun and threatened them. He then locked Mary in the trunk of the car while he sexually assaulted her friend Anita. He covered Mary's head with a black plastic bag and attempted to strangle her with a belt, but Mary fought back fiercely, preventing him from carrying out his plan. Eventually, the killer resorted to stabbing her multiple times in different parts of her body before slashing her throat. Meanwhile, Anita remained trapped in the trunk of the car, able to hear her friend's desperate cries for help, which filled her with terror as she realized she was about to face the same fate within moments. Unfortunately, her psychological torment did not last long, as the killer soon turned his attention to her, stabbing her violently and sadistically in the same manner as he had with her friend. It was clear that he had not yet satisfied his urges, as he took the bodies of the two victims back to his home and even took photographs of them to keep as mementos. Following this, he severed the heads from the bodies and sexually assaulted the corpses before he began dismembering them into smaller pieces, burying most of the remains in the Loma Prieta Mountains near Santa Cruz, and disposing of the rest in the trash. Who was Ed Kemper, and what was the nature of his life that turned him into this frightening monster? How did this dangerous serial killer eventually fall into the hands of the police? To find out the answers to these questions, stay with us for this episode, presented by the Shadows Channel, which always uncovers the mysteries of crimes and puzzles. Edmund Emil Kemper III, known later as Ed Kemper, was born in Los Angeles, California, and grew up in a medium-income family. His father was a construction worker, and his family was religiously conservative to the point of strictness, particularly his mother, Arnil, who was obsessed with controlling her children. She did not hesitate to abuse them and physically harm them to enforce her control. Additionally, Arnil's excessive demands caused her children to grow up psychologically confused about their bodies, as she viewed sex as sinful and something not to be discussed or desired. This instilled a troubled personality in young Ed, who found himself trapped by his dictatorial and violent mother. Kemper's sadistic psychological disturbances emerged clearly at an early age. He developed bizarre play activities as a young boy. For instance, he once cut off the heads and limbs of his younger sister's dolls, calmly explaining to her that dismembering the dolls brought him a sense of euphoria and happiness. He excelled in creating disturbing games, such as one he called the electric chair, where he would pretend to be on death row or ask his siblings to lock him in a room to simulate a gas chamber for death row inmates. His behavior escalated to shocking acts of violence, including killing the family cat, burying it in the backyard, and later exhuming the body to behead it, hanging the head over his bed as though it were a doll. For Ed, death and sex became inextricably linked. In one instance, he confessed to his sister Susan that the only way he could kiss the teacher he had a crush on would be to kill her first. He even expressed a desire for his father to die, despite having a much stronger relationship with him compared to the raging conflict he had with his mother. Arnil could not overlook her son's behavior, and fearing that he might sexually assault his sisters, decided to isolate him. She moved him to a room in the basement, which the family had abandoned, where Ed was forced to sleep alone, as if he were in solitary confinement. This solitude only deepened his psychological disturbances, causing him to nurture a deep hatred for his mother and women in general. Over time, Arnil realized that isolating Ed did not improve his mental health. On the contrary, his psychological issues worsened day by day. He brought her trouble with his schoolmates who bullied him for his massive physique, making Arnil eventually believe that the only solution would be to send him to live with his grandparents on a farm in North Fork. For Ed, life did not change significantly on the farm. He quickly noticed that his grandmother resembled his mother, a domineering woman who did not hesitate to issue strict commands. However, this time, Ed reacted differently and ended up taking his grandmother's rifle and shooting her, killing her instantly. This was the first of many crimes in a long series that would shake the American society. Naturally, the teenage boy fell into the hands of authorities. When questioned about the reasons for killing his grandmother, Ed calmly told investigators that he wanted to experience how it felt to kill. The investigators quickly realized they were dealing with someone deeply disturbed. He was admitted to a psychiatric institution where doctors diagnosed him with multiple psychological issues, such as schizophrenia and megalomania. This led the court to order his confinement to a state hospital in Atascadero, a facility specialized in housing sex offenders and criminals with psychological problems. Ed was a sick criminal, but he was not stupid. Rather, he possessed a high intelligence that allowed him to play the role of the model patient, rapidly responding to treatment and even volunteering to work at the facility, becoming the secretary for the psychological staff. Despite appearing to make progress, he continued to harbor dark thoughts filled with hatred toward women and had no intention of stopping his criminal activities. He merely planned to continue them while avoiding arrest. Eventually, Ed managed to convince the authorities that he deserved another chance, leading to his release in early 1969 when he was 21 years old. After leaving the psychiatric hospital, his singular obsession was to pick up hitchhikers. During the early 1970s, there was a surge of hippie culture, with young people traveling from town to town without paying fares by hitching rides with passing vehicles. Ed cleverly planned to integrate into that society, dressing like a hippie and styling his hair accordingly. However, he soon discovered that fitting in wasn't easy. Despite his appearance, his massive size and strong build frightened girls, making them reluctant to ride with him. Recognizing this, Ed needed to blend in more before executing his plan to target young girls. Things improved for him considerably when he obtained a permit from California University that allowed him to access campus. This permit enabled him to enter various universities across America. As time went by, Ed developed his social skills, particularly with girls, through constant interaction with hundreds of students on campus. He would often offer rides to them, carefully learning how to speak in a way that made potential victims feel comfortable without ever arousing their suspicion of the dangerous serial killer he was. The continuous movement also made him an expert on all the local routes, enabling him to identify the best locations for committing crimes and disposing of bodies. Ed recognized that college students would be his ideal victims, as they possessed high energy and enthusiasm, making them more willing to accept rides, especially after he introduced himself in a polite and friendly manner. For almost 3 years, Ed drove around California in his 3-door convertible, transporting students without harming any. During this time, he was still gathering information to execute his crimes perfectly, even modifying the car's door handles so that he was the only one able to control the locks. This way, if he secured the doors, it would be impossible for passengers to escape. Additionally, Ed always kept knives, a gun, garbage bags, and some fabric coverings in his car, as he never knew when he would start putting his plan into action. Estimates suggest that Ed made over 150 trips in his car between 1970 and 1973, during which he transported various passengers without harming any of them. Slowly, his meticulous study provided him with absolute knowledge of the best times and locations to abduct young women without being noticed. Meanwhile, his relationship with his mother was deteriorating, as she had remarried, and the new family did not welcome back the mentally troubled son who had killed his grandparents. This situation furthered Ed's daily arguments with his mother, and he began drinking excessively, becoming a regular at all the local bars. This was his way of escaping the hellish life he led with her. On May 7, 1972, Ed began executing his sadistic criminal plan by picking up 2 young students, Mary Bessie and Anita Luchis, from Francesca College, driving them to an isolated area where he stabbed them to death and then sexually assaulted their bodies. He dismembered them while severing their heads and disposed of the remains in an abandoned area. His next victim was Ikio, who was on her way to a dance class. Ed managed to convince her to get into his car, but she soon realized he was taking her down an isolated road. Despite his threats with a gun, Ikio fiercely resisted, but his larger size and greater strength soon allowed him to overpower her, sexually assault her repeatedly, and finally end her life. After placing Ikio's body in his trunk, he returned to his mother's home, wanting to see if she would notice anything unusual about him following his first two murders. Ed felt a sense of euphoria and victory when he realized that his mother did not notice any changes in his demeanor, confirming that his plan was still on track. He believed he could still convince society that he was an ordinary and kind man, even as the persona of the serial killer was festering within him. During this time, Ed remained under mandatory psychiatric treatment by authorities, meeting with a psychiatrist weekly. At one of those sessions, Ed masterfully convinced his therapist that his mental health had improved so much that the medical committee overseeing his case recommended the removal of the murder of his grandparents from his criminal record. These events further motivated Ed to continue his criminal activities. He frequently visited California University, which was close to his home, picking his victims from the campus. During that period in the 1970s, police stations throughout California were inundated with reports of missing persons, and human remains of young girls were discovered repeatedly in different locations across the state's deserts. Authorities struggled to piece together the puzzle of these disappearances, but it was evident to them that they were dealing with a serial killer, specifically targeting college-aged young women. Investigators later learned that most of the horrific crimes committed by Ed coincided with violent arguments he had with his mother. This meant that Ed somehow channeled his frustration and hatred toward his mother onto his victims. It was as if Ed was attempting to summon up his courage little by little to confront the source of his crises and hatred in life, his mother, the person responsible for driving him to commit these sadistic crimes. Eventually, he reached a point where he felt capable of striking back. Not only did he murder her, but he also beheaded her and sexually assaulted her, ultimately placing her head on a shelf in their home, screaming at it for a full hour. He then threw his mother's head away, keeping it in such a grotesque condition within the house. At this moment, Ed understood that his series of murders targeting college girls had come to an end, as he had successfully rid himself of the source of the evil in his life. However, he also realized that he could not escape the police this time, as he committed the murder against his own mother in their home, leaving him no way to dispose of her body in a remote location or cleanse the crime scene. At a certain stage, Ed arrogantly and sadistically plotted the conclusion of his story and decided to add one last victim stemming from his mother's circle, her close friend and coworker, Sally Halite. Ed thought about how to contact his mother's friend and persuade her to come to their house. However, his dilemma ended when the woman herself arrived at around 5:30 p.m., asking about her friend who had suddenly gone missing from work. Ed told Sally that his mother was not home, but asked her to return in 2 hours for dinner with him and his family, mentioning that his mother had prepared a feast to celebrate his new job. This ruse worked on the unsuspecting woman, who returned at the agreed time without realizing that Ed had been preparing the house to become a large execution chamber. He had hidden several knives throughout the various rooms, placed some handcuffs in his pant pocket, and ensured all the windows and curtains were tightly shut to prevent the woman from escaping her grim fate. When Sally arrived at the home around 8 p.m., Ed opened the door for her, apologizing for his mother's tardiness at the grocery store. He then escorted her to the couch in the living room, and as soon as the woman sat down, she saw Ed's massive figure looming over her, with malice radiating from his eyes. Ed struck Sally in the chest and abdomen with force, then grabbed her by the neck with all his strength, crushing her windpipe, leading to her immediate death. Even after her apparent demise, he strangled her again with trash bags, and the paper towels to ensure she was truly dead. Subsequently, Ed carried Sally's body to one of the beds in the house and went to calm his nerves with some alcoholic drinks at a bar frequented by police officers and detectives, where none suspected the killer, mingling with them over drinks. Later that night, Ed returned home, beheaded Sally, and placed her head next to his mother's on the shelf. He then fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, he wrote a letter confessing all his crimes and left it at home before driving to Pueblo, Colorado. Upon arrival, he called the police station and confessed to all his crimes in detail, but due to the horrific nature of his account, the officers did not initially believe him and thought he was just a drugged-up individual trying to mess with them. They soon discovered they were indeed dealing with a genuine serial killer when news arrived about the discovery of his mother and friend's remains at his family home. As a result, law enforcement took swift action to apprehend Ed Kemper, who was highly cooperative and confessed all the horrifying details of his brutal crimes, even indicating the locations where he buried the remains of his victims. His confessions were so disturbing that they caused physical discomfort for some attendants in the courtroom. On November 8, 1973, Ed Kemper pleaded guilty to all charges of murder and sexual assault brought against him and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.